We are live.
I see it. And we're live.
Okay.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome to the Newark Public Library's Black Music Month conversation, Brick City Vanguard, Amiri Baraka, Black Music and Black Modernity. My name is Dale Colston and I'm a librarian at the James Brown African American Room of the Newark Public Library in Newark, New Jersey. On behalf of our director, Jocelyn Bowling Dixon, and Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you all for joining us this evening. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape First Nations on which we are learning, laboring, and organizing today. We also recognize the devastation and the continued legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which contributed to present-day systemic racism and oppression. Our space at the library, the James Brown African American Room, was named in honor of the late James Library Brown, a librarian, poet, activist, and influencer who was instrumental in making sure that the library seek and maintain books and resources and present programs examining and celebrating the African American experience. Mr. Brown was especially committed to urging Newark youth to pursue education and to understand the importance of the library's role in their academic growth. Please visit our exhibit either in person or virtually. Black Power, 19th Century, Newark's first African-American rebellion reflects the research, artistry, and vision of our colleague, Noelle Lorraine Williams. It is available virtually at www.blackpower19thcentury.com and now in person. Black Power is one of the most controversial terms of the 20th century. Newark's 1960s Black Power movement and the 1967 rebellion dominate discussions about African-American activism in Newark, and for good reason. It was a piercing, hot wake-up call against the racism and violence that stalked Black lives. And Amiri Baraka was inseparable from the movement. Soon our guest will discuss a few aspects of his life and work. Now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Reggie Blanding, who will introduce our esteemed guest. Reggie.
All right, thank you so much, Dale. And yes, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're blessed and honored to welcome both of our guests. And I'm excited for this conversation. So thank you both. Please correct me if I miss anything, or I'm gonna go ahead and just intro both of y'all, starting with Tony Bolden, who is an associate professor of African and African American studies at the University of Kansas, where he teaches and writes about Black music, literature, and political issues. He is the editor of the Langston Hughes Review, and his publications include Afro Blue, Improvisations in African American Poetry and Culture, The Funk Era and Beyond, New Perspectives on Black Popular Culture, and his latest book, Groove Theory, The Blues Foundations of Funk. We need to do a program on that too, because man. Brother Bolden is currently at work on a collection of autobiographical essays while completing another book tentatively titled Funk Aesthetics, New Directions in Black Literary Studies. So again, thank you, Tony Bolden, for joining us. The guest, esteemed guest, Mr. James Smethurst, is professor of Afro-American Studies at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the author of the amazing book we'll be discussing tonight. For one, Brick City Vanguard, Amiri Baraka, Black Music and Black Modernity. Also, Behold the Land, the Black Arts Movement in the South. He's also co-editor with Sonia Sanchez and John H. Bracey Jr. of SOS, Calling All Black People, a Black Arts Movement Reader. His scholarly interests include African American literature, culture, and intellectual history from the late 19th century to the late 20th centuries, with particular emphasis on Black cultural and political radicalism, 20th century poetry in English, and gender studies. So do whatever, thumbs up emojis, snap your fingers, please give these two a hand. Thank you so much. And if we could just get into it, I think, if you haven't read the poster, just a quick Brick City Vanguard. I'll do the short, very, very short annotated synopsis of it. It takes a look at how Amiri Baraka's writing on and performance of music envisioned the creation of an African-American people or nation, as well as the growth and consolidation of a Black working class within that nation, which resonates to this day. So, Mr. Smethurst, I guess if we could start off with your inspiration to write this book.
Okay, yeah, sure, thanks. Before I get into that, though, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Reggie and Dale, for having me at the Newark Public Library. It's a beautiful library. I spent actually many years or many times, sitting around in it, reading books when it was a great place to just sit and read. And a great fondness for the city of Newark. I mean, my family, I'm in Massachusetts now, but we were there for about 150 years. So, I feel, this is part of, I guess, part of the inspiration of the book is, as people who know me know, I'm kind of a freak about Newark history and that sort of thing, and stories about it, which go back to the days of my grandfather telling me, stories of the city, including when he lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood, when he was, and what the city was like then when he was a child in the early 20th century. So there's that piece. So I feel really honored to have Tony Bolden, who I think is one of the best writers about music and literature and music that's out there. So it's I'm really happy to be here. So I guess my inspiration for the book, or I guess what I rarely have any great plan when I start a book. I often start a book with a sort of, a how come kind of question, something that's puzzling me, that gets me going into a subject deeper. And then eventually something hopefully that has some coherence comes out of it. So where this one started, the inspiration was, it was a sad and happy moment. It was at Amiri Baraka's funeral at Symphony Hall, the old Mosque Theater, in 2014. And the thing I was struck by, among other things, was not just all the great jazz musicians and writers and the local politicians. I mean, even politicians who really didn't like Amiri that much when he was alive showed up after he felt that his constituency needed him to be there. But that was impressive, of course. But what really impressed me is that the theater was packed, and that as far as I could tell, it looked like about 3/4 of the audience or more were everyday Newark people, which is to say, Newark being Newark, mostly everyday Black people from the city of Newark. And, as far as I could tell. And I was thinking to myself, has there ever really been a funeral with thousands of people in a big theater for Baptists and Muslims and all communists and every kind of person you can possibly imagine from the Black community in Newark and in environs, Irvington, Orange, East Orange, Hillside, Montclair, so on. But that has there ever been a funeral like this for a poet? Now, it's true that Amiri Baraka did a lot of things. I mean, first of all, just in terms of writing, I don't think there's been any other US writer in the 20th century into the 21st century, other than possibly Langston Hughes, who wrote so well in so many genres as did Amiri Baraka. I mean, he was a great poet. He was a great playwright. He was really, great sort of cultural critic. He was wrote some excellent fiction. I mean, that's just, librettos for sorts of operas. He did all kinds of stuff. So yeah, okay. But, still the poetry, I think, and he would have said this, was right at the center of his work. And, and obviously he was a political person. He was, working for the city of Newark since he returned at the end, and basically in 1966, end of 1965, and stayed there until 2014 when he died. And he, obviously the Baraka family and did a lot, and the fact that Ras Baraka is mayor is a testimony to that. I mean, a testimony to his own work, but also a testimony of the Baraka family. And to some extent, the people showing up at Amiri Baraka's funeral was a testimony to the whole family, including Amina, especially Amina, but also Ras. And but I was thinking, like, what motivated all these people to go there? Sure, he worked hard for the city of Newark. Sure, he was a great poet, great writer, and so forth. He was engaged with community. But he also, it struck me that I was thinking about it, that he had a way of sort of being as radical as you can be, both in a lot of ways, both in terms of his politics and also really in terms of his writing. And yet he was able to connect with people, massive, the broad groups of people. And that, and so what allowed him to connect? And it came to me, it was, this is no great flash, but it was the music and his feel for the music and his engagement with the music. So that's sort of where I started. And I also decided that I really didn't want to write so much about how the music influenced, say, his poetry, and informed his poetry and his other writing. I mean, I do a little bit of that, and I'm very interested in that. But there have been a lot of good people, really good people. I mean, Tony actually is one of them, but, Alden Nielsen, Kathy Lou Schultz, William Harris, Kimberly Benston, Amiri himself, who have written about the influence of on his art, his poetry. But I got interested in thinking about the idea of how he used the music to both understand for himself the idea of a Black nation, of a Black people, of a community, and also both as a kind of index, in other words, a way of understanding what the community is, but also the music as a kind of tool for forming the community. That, the music was both shaped by the people, but it also shaped the people. And it had a lot to do with his ideas of, and this is where the Marxism, we'll probably get to this, but I think he was doing this long before he got into Marxism, but he really thought carefully about it once he moves to Marxism in the early 70s. How the formation of a Black working class, and also thinking about, not only where the class has been, but where the class and Black people are going to go. What's the future? So, that's sort of how I got into it. But really, it's a Newark story in the sense that it was really sitting in the old Moss Theater, looking at all these people, as he might have said, all these blues people, and wondering, like, how'd they get there, right? Because, Tony, we were talking before, reminding us that there are some other people like Tom Dent in New Orleans who had a sort of similar connection down there who got these. But, I don't know if it's happened on that size before, and it certainly hasn't happened very much. So I hope that didn't go on too long, but that's sort of how it all began for me.
No, that's great. And I mean, it adds context to, the book. And Brother Bolden, I know you had you know, any thoughts to follow up just James' intro to his, you know, importance of Amiri and music and
Sure.
yeah.
Well, first I want to say thank you, you know, for having me and for organizing this, to you, Reggie, and to Dale, and thank you, James, for you know, it's always a pleasure, you know, to work with you. And
We've been on a show together before a time or two.
that's right. You always turn it out. So. All right, so you mentioned Marxism, and so I think let's start there. That is a prominent theme in your book, and of course, I want to say again, congratulations on your new book, Brick City Vanguard, Amiri Baraka, Black Music, Black Modernity. You know, Amiri Baraka's Marxism. Early in the book, you suggest that scholars haven't taken him seriously as a Marxist thinker, and I know this to be true. I've observed scholars, some of them very highly regarded. You know, who have referred to him as a nationalist in a presentation without any added context or sense of irony. So here's the question, actually a sort of a two-part question that gets to what you were talking about earlier. Why is it important that we understand Baraka in relation to a third world Marxism? And how does Black music figure into his framework?
Okay, I think that's a really good question, and it's a complicated question, and I hope I can do it justice. I mean, just a couple things to start. As you say, I think people, you know, Amiri Baraka and Marxism, in terms of our assessment of him, I mean, and of his importance, is twofold. You know, I think. I mean, on one hand, you know, downplaying his Marxism, you know, which is related, you know, has a result and is related to the fact that people don't really, even people who take some of his more straight up, you know, cultural nationalist stuff, although there are connections with the later stuff, which I argue in the book, they take that seriously. They don't take really the last 40 years of his career seriously, which coincidentally is the vast majority of the time that he's living in Newark, you know, as an adult. But I think that period, especially the last 20 years of his life or so, is some of the best stuff he ever wrote, ever did. I mean, I you know, tastes are relative, right? But, you know, to my way of thinking, the wise, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. So I think that, you know, one thing that happens is, you know, that this is literary poetry that for the most part is very engaged with music and very engaged with Marxism. And I think that's not taken seriously. The other thing is that when, you know, people talk about, and I suppose it's to the degree that you care about Marxism in the United States. I mean, that, you know, so that, I mean, that, you know, for people who are listening, you know, whether you're interested or not. But, you know, when people talk about the Marxist tradition in the United States and Marxist cultural thinkers, literary scholars, cultural figures, writers, Amiri Baraka is almost never mentioned, ever. If you're going to talk about Marxist cultural critics, people would talk about, I mean, not average people, but, you know, everyday people, but, you know, academic types would talk about Frederick Jameson maybe, or, you know, some other folks like that. But, you know, my way of thinking is that he's our Gramsci. He is in my view, he is the giant of giant Marxist writer in the United States, maybe ever, certainly since the Second World War. I mean, I can't think of anybody who has a body of work that compares to him. Again, plays, cultural criticism, librettos, performance with music. I mean, those great things that the inside songs of Curtis Mayfield that he did with William Parker. I mean, that's wonderful stuff. I mean, I don't see how any sane person can think that's not great, you know, unless you hate William Parker. I mean, unless you hate that kind of jazz. But so, you know, I think that one of the things that I wanted to do, and this isn't any deep reflection, you know, deep insight into Marxism or anything, though I do think Marxism does certain things and he does certain things with it, and it's important, is just to take Amiri Baraka's body of work and take his significant, you know, as seriously of that last 40 years, is to think about him, if you care about the Marxist tradition, and maybe you don't, but if you do, if you think it's an important tradition in the United States, if you have some kind of vision of it that leaves out Amiri Baraka, then you're really, you know, it's a pretty truncated version of Marxism in the United States. I mean, you know, so you get my point on those. So I think that those two things, you know, I think that, you know, where he goes with Marxism is, and the way he thinks about the music, and he's already thinking about this way when he writes Blues People, which in some ways is a Marxist influenced book. I mean, one of his great models, I mean, and he's someone who he retained an affection for really right to the end of his life, is the communist cultural critic Sidney Finkelstein, who wrote the Jazz, a People's Music, which was in a way, you know, not as good as Blues People, but doing some of what Blues People did beforehand. And I mean, I don't think Finkelstein was as deeply engaged with the music, but nevertheless, you know, I think if you were to think of predecessors for Baraka, it would be that, Hughes to some extent, and then of course Sterling Brown. But Sterling Brown didn't write that much. He you know, he talked, you know, like when Baraka was at Howard, and certainly Brown, who was a pretty left-wing guy, especially in the 30s and 40s, was pretty conversant with Marxism. So I think that what he tries to do is try to think about how, you know, the creation of a Black working class, a Black industrial working class, a Black industrial working class that had its roots, well, ultimately in Africa, but first stop after Africa, I mean, unwillingly, but first stop after Africa in the South, and the Black culture of the South. And then, you know, the migration to the North, where the Black industrial working class was forged in a new kind of way, North and West. And it was changed also in connection with other ethnic groups. In his youth, the big ones in Newark would have been Italian, Irish, Jewish, although, you know, significant numbers of Poles, other Eastern European groups, Ukrainians, Greeks, and then, you know, increasingly Puerto Rican as time goes on. You know, by the time he's, like, say, in college, there's already a substantial number. So, you know, you know, the encounters with these folks, but and also he thinks about, because of the Great Migration was this continuing thing for decades, you know, how the Black working class on one hand gets changed in their movement from the North to the South, but there's a way in which the connection is constantly refreshed, because there's this constant movement of people from the South to the North right up until the 1970s, especially in a city like Newark, where some phenomenally high percentage of the Black community was, you know, maybe on the order of 3/4 in the 1950s had been born in the South. And probably the people who hadn't, a lot of them, like Amiri Baraka, his parents were born in the South. And so that there's a way, so he uses Marxism as a way of thinking about this, thinking about the growth of a certain kind of class consciousness, which was both national and class at the same time. And I think one of the ways that he does it, partly because he was so drawn to it, but it was also, I think, a very visceral way of doing this, thinking about the music, how the music gets transformed in the move from the north to the south to the north. And both different living conditions, but also your interactions with other people, other sounds, if it were. You know, he very, very closely links it to language too, accents, if you will, and how it changes, families change. You know, and his family was a good example of that. You know, his parents were pretty, especially I think his dad were pretty Southern people. Amiri, you know, he could sound that way. And I think when he does sound particularly Southern, he's channeling his dad, but I think you might say his normal resting dialect to me, to my ears, it's Black, but it's Jersey. Frankly, you know, sometimes I could hear in Amiri Baraka's voice, and I mean, this is not some loopy, you know, like kind of identification. But you know, he sounded a little bit like my dad, who's, you'll be shocked to know is not Black, you know, but is a white guy born in Newark, roughly at the same time. Or if you listen to Allen Ginsberg, who has a Jewish inflection, kind of a Yiddish inflection, but his parents went to the same high school that Amiri went to. Ginsberg was born in Newark, though he moved to Patterson. Is their accents, you know, as I'm sure people here on this call or on this know, Jersey people don't sound like they do in real life, don't sound like they do on television, where they make us sound like we're from Brooklyn or someplace. Nothing against Brooklyn, but I'm just saying, we don't generally say Boyd. We don't say Joyzy, mostly. You know, nobody, you know, unless they were born in Greenpoint, Brooklyn or something and moved to Jersey. It's a little, you know, the old school accent is a little bit more like Philly, mid-Atlantic. And you can hear that in Amiri a little bit, I think. Does that, and so so the Marxism, I think, gives him a way, you know, both he uses this to talk about a kind of, you know, class consciousness and national consciousness, and in a way that I think can communicate to people, but also it's a way in which he was able to try to understand how it actually works. And the music is a beautiful way of thinking about it, you know, from the Barbary Coast early days, in the early days of the migration and the stride piano players on you know, around Lincoln Park and whatnot, you know, Willie the Lion Smith and what have you, right up through swing and bebop, you know, eventually hip hop, free jazz, hip hop, and actually house. Newark was important in the creation of house in the East Coast. I mean, that's a whole nother, you know, we go for a long time on that one. You know, maybe Tony, if you do your funk thing, I can be a commentator on your thing.
This must absolutely happen. So I'd love to.
So anyway, does that answer your question? I know I went on for a long time, but as I will, you know, so don't hesitate to stop me.
No, you know, so.
No, that's and I appreciate, you know, I think, and just I guess to be succinct, because Marxism in itself could be a whole program. You know, we often get these sort of ABC depictions of it. And I think for myself, musically, it's sort of been a conduit to particular ideologies. And I think, you know, just tethering, not even tethering necessarily, for lack of a better term at the moment, because it's 107 degrees, but in Jersey, and I'm feeling it. But, you know, just that relation. I think there was a point in my life where I didn't think of, you know, I wouldn't have intersected Marxism and sort of Black power. So I think definitely that your book helped sort of clarify that, and could be an entry point for people who say, oh, okay, this is what Amiri represented, or one of several ideologies he worked with throughout his life. I do want to mention, I know we kind of, we have a few things to cover, but I did get a comment, and thank you to anyone who's watching on Facebook, that someone did mention, if you won't mind me sharing a comment / question from Jacqueline Butterfield. She just mentioned, in my perception, and I was in my teams at the time, the main amalgamation of Amiri Baraka's poetry and music, and listing such musicians as Gary Bartz and Reggie Workman, was Black nationalism. Can you elaborate on that and why Marxism came into his view? So if if you can address that, but shout out to even.
Well,
Gary Bartz.
I think, yeah, definitely when he was working with Gary Bartz, and there's that great recording that he does of It's Nation Time, and that on that whole album, and that particular, and the title song, or whatever it is, poem thing, that Gary Bartz plays on that. And yeah, Reggie Workman, Archie Shepp, lot of great musicians. And then into the 70s, people like David Murray and so forth. Yeah, I mean, he does, I guess, he does sort of move out of what we might think of as straight up cultural nationalism he kind of moves out of that in the early 70s. The chronology of it is not entirely clear to me. But by 73 or 74, I mean, he's pretty close. He's close with a follower of Maulana Karenga and the sort of Kawaida movement for a while. And then, in the early 70s, around 73, he's into what's called revolutionary Kawaidaism. And then, which is really more of a direct amalgamation of, as I see it, of sort of Kawaidism and Karenga's stuff, and that, and Marxism, and then he moves up into a more straight up Marxism. But I mean, I don't think Baraka ever stopped being a nationalist in a sense. He wasn't necessarily a separatist precisely, but I mean, or he believed that, which is actually in the United States is not that strange to Marxism. That's a long story in and of itself. The idea of a Black nation. I mean, that idea came out of the Communist Party and the Communist International back in the late 20s. So, I mean, his view is nationalism and Marxism weren't necessarily antithetical. Maybe Marxism and cultural nationalism were antithetical. I mean, the kind of Kawaidism was kind of, and so I think there were a number of reasons why he moved away from that. I think part of it was, and by the way, this is an important part of my book, which is to talk about the impact of Amiri Baraka on Amiri Baraka, which I think she does not get enough credit. I mean, it's not so much about her work as a poet and an artist directly, because there are other people. There's a really great scholar out on the West Coast named Kim McMillan, who's doing work more directly on Amiri Baraka. So I wouldn't want to step on her project, but that, and Amina, I think, was always probably more to the left than Amiri, even when they were both cultural nationalists, partly because she had trouble with the gender politics of Kawaidaism as it was in the late 1960s. And so she pushed, I think the other thing, and this is what Baraka himself said, and I think it's probably, there's certainly truth to it, is that his feeling that, you know, that having Black mayors in Newark, say, were not enough, or Detroit, or Cleveland, that, you know, that there was very possible for you to work to get Black people elected or build certain kinds of Black institutions, and then things don't change that much. That you still, the people of Newark continue to suffer. And, you know, poverty, you know, I mean, in fact, the 80s might have been worse in Newark in some respects than the 60s. I guess, possibly. I mean, better in some ways. I mean, I don't think, and he would not have denied, you know, that it made a difference getting Kenneth Gibson elected, getting, you know, Black people into city government in a new kind of way. I mean, it did make a difference in the city. It made a difference in the way Black people were treated in the city. You know, I think, you know, like in Detroit, I mean, obviously the police force continued to be problematic in Detroit, but they were certainly, it made a difference when Coleman Young was elected mayor of Detroit. So I don't think he would deny that, but in terms of making the changes that the people of the city of Newark really needed, because, you know, this was the period of time, I think, I can't remember if it was the 80s or 90s, where, you know, basically the state took over the schools. You know, I mean, until fairly recently, you know, the school system wasn't even controlled by the people. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so, you know, I think Amiri Baraka, you know, came to the conclusion that a different kind of politics was really necessary to deal with the problems that people, like people in Newark, not just, and Newark faced. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why he was so deeply into Newark, and this also has to do with Amiri Baraka, but who got him particularly into Newark, that's another question, another story, you know, perhaps. But I just say is because Newark, it's a particular place, it's got its own particular characteristics and so forth, like any place does, but in a certain way, it's also typical of cities and conditions that Black people, working class Black people in the United States live in a way that maybe New York City is not. You know, it's a different, you know, it's traditionally this, I mean, culturally very vibrant, culturally very interesting, but it's also kind of a workaday, you know, city, you know, former industrial city, like a lot of places where, and that's the, you know, basically, whether you're talking about Newark or Birmingham or Toledo or Cincinnati or whatever, you know, this is where most Black people in the United States live, you know, cities like that, North and South. They mostly don't live in New York or Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
Even Detroit is really more like Newark than it is like, say, LA or New York. And this is not casting shade on New York or Los Angeles, but I think that he, you know, that was, you know, what I think particularly you know, was important to Amiri, and this is where he starts thinking about Marxism, is that Newark was both particular, it was special, but it also was representative. And he didn't think that the old politics just dealt enough with Newark. I mean, you know, the people there in the Central Ward and the South Ward, and eventually, you know, the West Ward, and, you know, or for that matter, Puerto Ricans in the North Ward.
Right, absolutely. And
or Portuguese in the East Ward, you know, for that matter.
And I just to thank you absolutely for bringing up Amina. And of course, we had a comment. Amiri Baraka is, all caps, prime mover, indeed, amen. So someone very happy you mentioned her as well as myself. But I know Tony definitely has a few, there's another follow-up. So yeah, appreciate, thank you for that answer. And yeah, hopefully that clarified his sort of move or between or nationalism and Marxism. But the Bolden, yeah. Oh,
You're muted, Tony.
yeah.
Oh, sorry about that.
All good.
So, well, in Brick City Vanguard, you talk a lot about blues people, and you explain a number of reasons why uh, that was such an um, important book. One of the things that you say that I thought was really intriguing, that I think has implications for today, almost kind of neo-colonial implications, at least from where I stand anyway. So because you say, or you point out that when, and for those of you, who are listening, who may not know, Ralph Ellison reviewed Blues People, and he said that Baraka's um, sort of predilection or tendency to use what he calls sociology was enough to give the blues the blues. It's sort of funny, but you point out, Jim, that after Ralph Ellison's review, that white reviewers, and I take that to mean, sort of establishment figures, really were struck a different tone. And I actually think something similar is going on today. But can you talk about that, or any number of, why is blues people so important, and maybe connected to that thread?
Well, I mean, Blues People is important because, um, he does something in Blues People that, as I said, Sidney Finkelstein in Jazz of People's Music tried to do sort of something like what Blues People was, but on a much, it was more like an introduction, I think, in Finkelstein's book, to the idea of jazz as expressing a kind of national identity, a people's identity, a sort of people's psychology, a people's, and by people, I mean a people's, I mean, not like the People's Republic of China, but more like a people or nations, communities, sensibility, history, experience, and so forth. And, but he doesn't really get deep into it. And I think and he doesn't really historicize it in the same way that Baraka does. So, Baraka is really the first, and allegedly, or legendarily, I should say, allegedly makes it sound like I don't believe it. Legendarily, Sterling Brown was supposed to have done something like this, with students like the SNCC people and Baraka and A.B. Spellman at Howard University. He would, they would hang around with him and drink bourbon, and he would tell them stories and that, do that same kind of thing. But in terms of really writing it, to talk about, really try to, not only talk about jazz as the expression of a kind of people's sensibility, a people's history, a people's psychology and identity, but historicize it and historicize the process of the creation of this people, which is, again, the music is both, it's an expression, it's kind of an index. In other words, if you want to know where the people are at a certain point, look at the music. If you can have the ears to hear what's going on. But also as something that helps form the people, as a sort of a key aspect of what we might say is the formation of a certain kind of national consciousness or identity. And he really, and really, it's also kind of, an early version of what we might now, I think of it as being sort of like really the beginning of cultural studies. That's one of my little claims. I mean, this is before the Birmingham School in Britain and Stuart Hall and those people are doing that. So it's that. It's also, kind of what we might call now affect studies, feeling, in literature and art and culture, expressive culture, but it's really, trying to be material about feeling and the music, historicize it, and what does it mean at a certain thing. And I think that was really important. I mean, people have, he made, I think we can say, made errors. In terms of the historical stuff, there wasn't a lot that he had to work with. He wasn't a professional historian. And I'm not saying that it would have been a better book if he had been, but there weren't any professional historians that were studying what he was studying, really. I mean, there was nothing for him. He had,
That's important.
that's the other thing is he's like creating a field.
Yes.
We don't always, I mean, I think in Africana studies, there are a fair number of people who have some sense of the importance of the book in that kind of way. We may not get always into the minutia of it, but we have a sense of its importance. But out of Africana studies, Black studies, I don't think we really think, that he basically creates a field. I mean, he creates a whole body, everything that comes after him that kind of tries to historicize the meaning of the music, try to figure out what is the meaning of form, what is the meaning of, what is the work that the musical form, cultural form does. I mean, he in Black culture anyway, I mean, he does it. And so I think that's really important. Now, Ellison, I think, it's odd, my argument is I think Ellison was just using Baraka to do something else. I mean, I sincerely believe that he might not like Baraka. For one thing, Baraka always liked Invisible Man. He always drew from Invisible Man, really right up to the end of his, if you listen to some of those recordings with Robert Parker, where he's talking about, however many degrees of invisibility and stuff. I mean, he's doing that, but he says some snarky things about Ellison, because Ellison was sort of the establishment. And so maybe Ellison was was not exactly he wasn't Langston Hughes, right? That stuff didn't roll off his back. He took revenge on people for doing that kind of thing. So that might have been part of it. But I also think that, my argument is that I think that he had undergone political changes. He saw himself differently, and he was using that review to try to reposition his own work. And all the essays in Shadow and Act to reposition his own work in terms of how it fit into the culture of the United States in a way that if you had only ever read Invisible Man, the idea that Ellison is optimistic about US culture, frankly, I don't really see how people get that from Invisible Man, unless you've read Shadow and Act and you've heard this stuff about America and American culture and stuff, so forth, and fingering the jagged grain and all that stuff. And then you might reread it. Anyhow, so I think that Blues People is this enormously important book. Also, I think that it's that debate, which is why I write about both of them, which around that book review, which did change how people read, because the reviews of Blues People, there weren't so many, but the ones that I could find of Blues People before Ellison wrote his were almost universally favorable. They were very different, at least as far as white reviewers went afterward for a long time. And, but also I think that it's important because I think that was part of the, Ellison's recreating himself and his body of work and his own legacy, which, in our field, what everyone thinks about the politics of Ralph Ellison. I mean, he's clearly a major writer, right? He's clearly a certain giant in Black literature and US literature. And so, that also is an important aspect of which Baraka's take on music and Blues People is a part of, even though I don't think Amiri ever intended that to be happy when, he basically, his comment was something about Ellison really reamed me or something like that.
Yeah, well,
It's not to be implied here, but that's. that was, I think, a verbatim quote.
No, I was going to say, I just think that there, the fact that when you point that out, whether or not Ellison intended for this, but I think that when you were talking about, for example, Africana studies, that there's a kind of there are different trajectories within the field, and a number of the intellectuals, I think, I think it's safe to say today that there are a number of people who followed Ellison's um, in Ellison's direction, particularly in relation to Baraka's radicalism, or his class-based consciousness, the need to foreground community-based aesthetics, community-based institutions. That's almost laughable in certain circles. And so and that particular notion of what Black studies should be has become conventional in many ways. So that's why I thought that your point there is really, we haven't really talked. In fact, it's almost taboo to talk about it. And so I think that you touched on a very important point there. Anyway, so Reg, what did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, actually, yes, to both those points. I appreciate both y'all making that, because of course, we've had recent conversations around Juneteenth about sort of the honoring sort of the more grassroots or grounded aspects of it, as opposed to these sort of upper tier, political moves, if you will. That the power. To sum it up succinctly, power is people, and I think that's part of a major part of the Black arts movement channeled. So we're down. We program till 7. We got always make 15 minutes or so wiggle room, and honestly, this is not something you just wrap up in an hour. So I have more questions.
Especially if it's me, yeah.
But you know what? It's such a rich subject. Like, how do you make all of this succinct? And again, what you've done and presented is, it's a lot to process and very much needed. So again, thank you for.
Well, thank you, Reg. I mean, go ahead. I was going to, you go ahead.
I had a question. I don't know, I guess as lightning round as possible, but one of my favorite aspects of the book is something I didn't think about, was just this sort of like tracing of history through liner notes. You do Baraka's development. So maybe even just a few words on that, and maybe just through maybe 2 albums, like a shifting point between a prior album and a next album.
Well, actually, my feeling is, because he's starting, he like a lot of bohemian types, a lot of them have these sorts of hack jobs, and that's been the tradition of Bohemia for a long time. You do journalism, you do some kind of thing to keep yourself alive while and what he did is he got into writing liner notes, and he happened to get there for Prestige Records, right, sort of as a little bit after the beginning of what we might think of as the liner note revolution, which is really coextensive with the large-scale recording of bebop, on Blue Note, Prestige, some of those other Savoy, I guess. I don't know how much they were on liner notes, but those places, and they, this whole new thing that's part of the, the packaging, the making you feel like you're hip, the sort of consumer guide aspect. And so Amiri, though, was somebody who Amiri Baraka took these things and took them seriously in a certain kind of way. I mean, we know that partly because some of his later ones are collected in the book Black Music, like the famous one about Billie Holiday, a couple really well-known ones about John Coltrane. But I guess my argument is right from the very beginning, it turns out that he's already kind of like doing in liner notes sort of what he's doing in Blues People.
Mm.
And that you can really trace, you know, an arc, a very similar arc like you do from Blues People through the Changing Same, through his black art stuff, that you can just do with his liner notes. I mean, and I have to say, I didn't really know, to be truthful, what I was going to find, because I hadn't read a lot of them. Because, you know, one of the great things about the cyber age, which I figured out, is it used to be that if you wanted to read them, you would have had to spend a boatload of money to deal with rare record dealers and see if you could, you know, and even then you might not find them. But because now that there are all these sorts of sort of collectors sites, kind of like the journal, The Record Trader, that he worked for when he was a young man in Lower Manhattan, but they're all online. And what you can do is you can actually look at the front and the back cover of the albums. And I realized that all of his liner notes were online. So I actually was able to read them all. And I'm not sure that there's probably, I mean, I'm not absolutely sure that there's anybody who up until, I certainly hadn't, but, you know, figured out, you know, I mean, that we, you know, because the technology, I mean, the technology isn't that new, but the organization of this stuff is relatively new, that you could actually just sit down and get them all and just sit down and read them all. And so that's when I really, you know, I didn't know for sure. I was just curious to see what I would find. And I did find that there was this kind of arc, you know, and he starts off kind of where he is with Blues People, but, you know, kind of develops it more in a black nationalist sense till, you know, I make an argument in the liner notes that maybe when does the black arts movement start? Well, you know, some people say when he moved, you know, I mean, obviously no movement starts like this, but, you know, the historic date is often him going uptown after the assassination of Malcolm X to with a bunch of other folks after talking with Muhammad Ahmed, then Max Stanford, about, you know, carrying out Malcolm X's notion of starting a cultural center and school in Harlem. And that's often given as a sort of start date. But what if the start date was the liner notes for the John Coltrane at Birdland? It sounds an awful lot like the stuff he'll be writing in a year or two on the Changing Same, you know? So, I mean, I guess, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I was just, you know, I was just having fun, really. I was just like reading this stuff and saying, oh man, this is really more interesting than I thought it was going to be. Because like I said, I'd read some of them, but he wrote a lot of them back in those days. You know, I mean, I don't know, what was it, 20 of them maybe, something like that. And
yeah,
it was kind of interesting.
That's great. And Tony, I know you have another question, but if you can kind of follow up on that, because I am very interested in that aspect of sort of study through liner notes. And I'm curious, you know, you both sort of cultural studies utilizing music, and have you sort of had, you know, sort of traced that arc as well? Anything that sort of stood out to you, maybe even to hear?
I mean, I was partly inspired, I have to say, by this book by Brand Edwards called Epistrophes, which is in part, you know, it's about the music, but it deals a lot with what you might call, what they, you know, in the business call ephemera, you know, the sort of stuff that are supposedly extraneous or kind of add-ons to the music, but actually are an important part of the whole thing. But go ahead, Tony. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
No, that's fine. No, I think
just want to grant credit, you know.
No, it's cool. I think that your last statement, in many ways, about the a possible reimagining of the beginnings of the Black Arts movement encapsulates in many ways, Amiri Baraka's artistic philosophy, the idea that Reg is talking about, that you explained so well in the book, of understanding Black culture, Black history through the music. You know, essentially, I mean, you know, I'm oversimplifying, but we have, you know, a tendency to think about it as entertainment. And then you have other people who sort of look at lyrics, and, you know, some of the aesthetic aspects of it, but we generally don't see it as a kind of conceptual, you know, a kind, you know, a space where the conceptual principles of the culture, you know, cross generational, you know, and that's the way. So to see the music, you know, the liner notes as a possible space or spot where the Black Arts movement begins, sort of gets to that. You know, as a closing note, here's my question. Based on your, you know, conversations with Baraka and your extensive reading of his work, you know, because Baraka, his famous essay, as you pointed out, the question is how do you sound, or how you sound? And today, storytelling in music is often visual. You know, it happens in videos. So based on what you have read and your conversations with him, how do you see, how do you think he, um, you know, what were his responses um, to the shift toward away from sound as a unit of meaning, as a primary unit of meaning, toward, you know, the visual form of signification?
Well, that's interesting. You know, I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, he was somebody who was extraordinarily interested in the visual too. I mean, besides being a painter, you know, sometimes. I mean, he, you know, like you have seen that little short movie that they've discovered of the new arc, maybe. But that, you know, he was always interested in film and stuff. His problem was back in the day, you know, in Newark, is that, you know, video was not, you know, it was just too expensive. This was before the personal video. So I think he was very interested in that. He was always interested, you know, in the visual aspect of performance. You know, even, I mean, even in his short story like The Screamers, where he talks about seeing Jay McNeely and other sort of honking saxophone players in the Hill, in the Central Ward in Newark, and in the clubs as a young person. I mean, it's the sound, but the sound is very closely, you know, connected to the visual of, like, you know, sweat dripping off somebody's hair, walking across the bar, honking, that kind of thing. So I don't think, you know, he had a problem with the visual. I think with hip hop, if you were thinking about the hip hop move, he did have issues. I mean, he liked hip hop in a lot of ways. He said he especially liked it early on. He felt that there was a move to a certain kind of corporatization and commercialization, and, you know, I mean, and that is one aspect of the visual, is it costs a lot of money to do that, and that there is a way in which, although some people, you know, even people we don't think of conscious rappers like Lil Wayne, you know, and God Bless America, I mean, he does, or Ice Cube, who was also disgraced himself politically recently, I suppose, from a certain perspective. Nevertheless, gangster rap made me do it. I mean, the visuals, you know, the song, the rapping, the song, whatever you want to call it, the spoken word performance is powerful. but without the visuals, the critique would be far less. So I think Baraka would be into that. I think he was more worried about, these people, this art that got taken, that came out of the street, basically. I mean, really, quite literally, or the housing project, rec room or courtyard or what have you, and somehow ended up being somewhere else. I think that part disturbed him. I mean, he was close to Sister Solja, who was from, I think was a friend of his son's. I mean, they might have gone to high school together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's
Swing from verb to noun. I actually
Or
heard.
refugees, I mean, of course they, if they were from Jersey, he would, I think, forgive them, because I'm not sure that, Wycliffe Jean is always the best, politically, is a little hard to predict also. But, so I think, that's okay. That's my answer. Yeah, I could just leave it there. I won't go on.
Yeah, no, but I was going to just say, he predicted this. I heard him. I mean, what you're talking about, and we
Right.
need other people there are other people who could propose counter arguments. But one of the things that he said, he came to New Orleans and did a reading, 1993, and he said, somebody, Baraka, he'd it'd be a Q&A after the reading. And so somebody asked him what he thought about rap. And he said, "Oh, I love rap. That's like the old ballad." He started historicizing. That's all I listen to in my house. My kids and so forth. And then he said, "But I think rap is gonna reach a point like jazz did, and they're gonna have to decide, which way." So as you were talking, I thought about, again, blues people, swing.
I mean, I will say and I will say one other thing that I think he said, and I mean, I think in some ways he looked at hip hop as part of the genius of Black people and Black youth in dealing with what we might call the post-industrial crisis, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, where cities, many cities in the United States are now. I mean, the ones that aren't being gentrified, where whole neighborhoods have been total, where there are no jobs, or all that stuff, and how that's changed things, and impoverished the cities, impoverished the schools, and so forth. That's part of the genius, but there's a certain negative side to hip hop, which is in the sense that it's not really the fault of hip hop, but it's an index of this again, is that part of the reason that hip hop has risen up and has gone where it is because they don't teach music in the schools anymore. You don't have bands in the school anymore. You don't learn how to play instruments in the schools anymore in the way that, there's no music education for working class Black people in most cities, not a city like Newark. And Baraka complained about that very vociferously, about the destruction of this. So, there's a way in which hip hop to some degree is a fact that, people aren't playing saxophones, they're not playing the drums, they're not playing, because they don't have the access to the kind of training that young people in an earlier generation, we were just doing this jazz program at UMass, and, even the younger jazz players, and by younger, I mean in their 40s, mid to late 40s, I mean, they were saying that, a couple of them were from Detroit. For the people who came after them, the stuff doesn't exist anymore, the stuff that they had. It was the end, they were the last. And I think in that sense, there's a way in which Baraka was unhappy about, that impoverishment of that kind of music, and which, we see in jazz, right? I mean, there are Black players in jazz, but I think it's a lot harder for working class young Black people to get into. I mean, it's not just a question of taste, but even get the training in jazz that it was, unless you happen to be in some city where there's some remains of the Black Arts Movement schools left over, where you might get something like that.
So I'm gonna interject because we unfortunately, I think we may need to do a podcast. We might just have to like build offline. I do want to add my own personal thing. I believe my introduction to Amiri was through the Roots, Something in the Way of Things. And both of y'all made amazing points because it's the hip hop, you know, this is where we end, but the story continues. You know, it's absolutely been commodified and, you know, sort of turned into this corporate entity. But I think bubbling underneath the surface of those paid commercials and radio payola, I think there is still just a strong undercurrent that adheres to the tenets of, you know, things that people like Baraka and Don L. Lee did. I mean, there's a new rap album that is based off of the works of Bob Kaufman, you know.
Oh, okay. I gotta hear this.
I'll send you the link when.
Send me the link, please, please.
Absolutely. But man, I do want to thank John, who left a amazing comment for all of us. James, thank you for the work that you put in on this book, and I mirror his sentiment as well. So thank you, John Curley. I see Sister Dale here. Man, again, I wish we had.
Thank you ever so. This was absolutely fabulous. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was such an honor, you know, to be part of the Newark Public Library, something to do with the Newark Public Library, you know. Much respect to the people of Newark, you know.
Thank you.
And
Appreciate y'all both.
You have a better mayor than I do.
I just want to say my very first professional gig was in the New Orleans Public Library. And actually that was the most rewarding job that I ever had. So
yeah, thank you. Thank you. And we encourage anyone out there to support your public library. All those who can and will purchase the books by these two wonderful authors today. If you can, donate them to your own public library if they're not able to put them in their collections, but they will be valuable reading for any collection. Thank you.
Man,
Thank you.
Thank you both. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. So peace,
To
love,
the next gig, Tony, wherever that is.
all right.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to it.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Be well,
Take
everyone.
care.
Bye-bye.
And thank you, Beth. Peace.
Yes, thank you, Beth.
All right.